Hello everyone and welcome back, Dace here. Here's a question for you all. When you first got into shmups, were there any terms you assumed meant one thing but ended up having completely different meanings? Or maybe you had a basic understanding but later realized there was a lot more to it than you initially thought. There was a time in my earlier STG days when I thought no miss meant you didn't miss destroying a single enemy in any given stage or during the entire run for that matter. Thankfully, I learned the meaning not long after that and avoided situations like going online and telling the world, hey, I no missed this game and that game. But you might be wondering why I'm doing a video on shmup terms when people can just look it up online. Well, it's a valid question and I do have an answer. When it comes to shmup terminology, resources online are few and far between. Not every person new to the genre will want to look up a list or scroll through a thread on Reddit where the information is scattered amongst numerous comments. Maybe you're even an STG veteran who just wants to fall asleep to the sound of my voice. I get it, I've been there before. Either way, sometimes people just like having something they can watch or listen to in the background while getting at other activities. So I decided to consolidate a bunch of sources and share that information here in my own words. I feel as though it's easy to take our understanding of something for granted when we've been in the realm for some time, but that doesn't mean all the facets we are aware of will be evident to those completely new to the genre. And sure, newcomers can likely figure out the meaning of something just by hearing or seeing the word, but I still believe that having a more well-rounded idea of something can often lead to knowing how to use it more to our advantage than a basic understanding of something. An example of this would be bombs. Everyone can guess what bombs do, but not everyone coming into the STG fold will just assume that iframes are involved or that bombing can be used for strategic planning instead of just moments of panic. That being said, some terms will have specific footage to convey an idea better, but not everything. With the list sitting around 130 items, it would be fairly time-consuming, impractical, and unnecessary to demonstrate everything with relevant gameplay. So with that out of the way, let's get into this. One CC is short for 1 credit clear or sometimes 1 coin clear. It just means that you've completed all of the stages without getting it game over or using any continues to prolong the run. You may also see the term 2-all, which relates to games that have a second loop accessible after completing the first loop, and this just means that both loops were completed on a single credit. Sometimes accessing the second loop will have specific requirements beyond simply surviving the first loop. Lastly, you may see the term all clear. This means all stages, including the stages of multiple loops, have been cleared on a single credit. Sometimes this will include secret bosses, while other times players may title a video of their run as an all clear, even though they haven't triggered the true last boss. But from what I've seen, either works and typically people don't freak out over it. Some examples would be saying you just got your Dodonpachi Daifukatsu Black Label All Clear or Dodonpachi Daifukatsu Black Label All Clear plus Hibachi and Zatsuza to specify what's all included. And yeah, I know that's a mouthful. An aimed shot is anything an enemy fires directly at your ship or character, instead of an attack fired in a random or predetermined direction. Alternate view is a term used for shmups with vertical and horizontal orientations throughout the run. So the game may be predominantly horizontal, but there could be a section or two in, let's say, stages 3 and 4 where you go up a robot-controlled mineshaft or something. Arcade mode almost always means the game's main mode of play when on a home console. This mode will be an exact reproduction of the original arcade release or the closest possible thing. It will always boil down to what system the game has come to and what tweaks were necessary during the porting process. Sometimes you may hear someone say arena shooter or free roaming shooter, and this is just a game that is played in a couple of ways. It could be a single chamber where the player roams the space freely and there's no scrolling involved, or it could be where there are other rooms or areas attached and you can go from screen to screen. Arrange or arrange mode is an altered version of the original game and is usually accessible from the main menu with any other included versions. Think of it as a remix of what you are already familiar with. The arrange mode may have slightly modified mechanics, music, sound effects, or even artwork. Generally speaking, this mode will not have enough changes for it to feel like an entirely new game though. But arrange modes will typically have their own set of strategies and routes depending on how the game is approached with modified mechanics, enemy spawning, bullet patterns, etc. Furthermore, arrange mode in most games will almost always have its own leaderboard separate from others. Auto fire, auto shot, and full auto are all the same thing, and it's pretty self-explanatory. If your shmup has an auto fire feature, you likely have a designated button which you can hold down to fire continuously. This feature saves you from needing to tap the fire button repetitively for the same result. Sometimes you'll be able to switch this feature on or off in the options menu, while other times you may have two separate buttons, one for auto fire and one for tap firing. Unseasoned players might assume that auto fire is always better, and I can understand that, but depending on the situation and the weapon's rate of fire, there may actually be times where tapping the button instead of holding it down proves to be more beneficial. One example I'll share is Solar Striker. When holding down the fire button, you'll have a burst of 3 shots, followed by a pause before the next 3 shots fire. Depending on your timing, enemy positions, movement speed, etc., you may miss enemies and drastically increase the risk of getting hit. Never rely on auto fire as if it's this fail-proof win condition, because it's not. Auto fire rate may sound like the same thing as fire rate, but it actually means the number of shots fired in an individual burst while using auto fire. Some games will allow you to adjust this so that it's like you're pressing the button so many times per second. Backfire is what we call it when our ship or character can fire from the rear. This ability is sometimes available as a default, while other times it may be granted through something like an item drop. Base point value is a term more relevant to games with elaborate scoring systems, and it just means the base amount of points you'll receive for destroying an enemy. The base point value does not include any additional points calculated and received for multipliers or other bonuses. Generally speaking, a blast 'em up is a game where there really isn't any scoring system involved. Shmups like this are more or less older ones where you just blast things apart. Bombs are incredible and an absolute saving grace if used wisely. Typically, bombs are high damage, screen clearing weapons you can use in a pinch. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but that's the general meaning. There will also usually be a period of invincibility either during the entire explosion or at least part of it. Depending on the game, you can obtain bombs in various ways. Sometimes you'll be able to pick up a bomb item on screen, other times you'll receive one as a bonus for completing a level or something else. You might get a score-based bomb after hitting a certain number of points, or even have a gauge you can fill up like in Crimson Clover. Sometimes you might be playing with a cooldown system too. There are all sorts of combinations. If you lose a life, you'll typically receive the default amount of bombs, but not always. For example, in Devil Engine, you always have however many you had in stock before losing a life. When all is said and done, bombs are awesome. If you're like me, you might even view bombs as extra lives because of the longevity they can provide if used wisely. I don't find bomb delay to be too common in the games I play, but there are some games where using a bomb will have a delay after pressing your bomb button. Essentially, the way to work with this type of bomb is to plan your use carefully because they aren't designed to save you the instant you need them to. Not going to put too much time into this one, but bomb stock is simply the maximum amount of bombs you can hold. There is a hard limit in some games, while in other titles there won't be a maximum number. A bonus can come in all forms. It might be a golden token that grants you additional points, or it could be points received at the end of the stage, like when you no-miss a level and you get an extra 100,000 points for that success. Some STGs feature weapons which act like boomerangs. The projectile can be fired some distance before it returns to the player. The attack will usually damage whatever it touches on the way out and back. A boss alley can have variations, but it's definitely different from a boss rush mode. A boss alley is essentially any part of a stage where you're going up against a series of bosses you've either encountered previously or are facing for the first time. If anyone was wondering, Boss Rush is the game mode where the player is only fighting bosses. Sometimes you'll face bosses in the order you would normally encounter them, other times it will be randomized, like in Devil Engine for instance. Bullet cancelling can appear in a variety of ways. In some games, enemy bullets still on the screen will vanish or become harmless once the enemy that fired them has been destroyed. Other times, bullet cancelling might appear as part of a hyper mode like in Dodonpachi Daifukatsu, where your spread shot while in hyper mode can eliminate bullets. There are undoubtedly other ways bullet cancelling can play out, but I'm not going to cover everything under the sun because I'm sure you all get the idea. Depending on the game, this mechanic will often be tied to things like scoring, gaining items, or it can trigger other effects. Bullet Hell, also known as Manic Shooter or Danmaku, is an offshoot from traditional shmups. These are the ones with thousands of bullets on screen with mesmerizing patterns, crisscrossing, weaving, unfolding in brilliant displays, you name it. Playing these types, especially on harder difficulties, will require careful planning and maneuvering. One such example is Danmaku Unlimited 3, which was my first bullet hell. In a nutshell, bullet hurting is when you position yourself somewhere on the screen to draw enemy fire towards you intentionally. This creates breathing room elsewhere which you can then move to after the fact. You might move slowly and remain close to the projectiles to prevent the attack from spreading all over the screen. This technique is vital in games with a lot going on simultaneously. When you know two enemies are about to release a spray of 1,000 bullets and you've got enemy lasers powering up to fry your ass and whatever else, you'll want to lead their shots somewhere so you can maintain some open space. Just what it sounds like, a bullet maze is when a boss's attack is so dense that weaving through it without being hit requires very careful and skilled movement. A great example of this is the final boss of Mushihime-sama, or literally countless other games that have full-screen attack patterns. Bullet pattern or formation is a term used to describe a recurring attack from a boss or any given enemy. Attack patterns can be memorized so that with just a glance the player knows how it will move and how to maneuver through or around it. Bullet spam is what we call it when an enemy or boss shoots a spray of bullets in your general direction. A cannon can look like anything but will typically be some form of stationary ground-based or ceiling-based enemy unit that fires upon the player. Cannons are often tucked away close to surfaces that may cause damage or even loss of life, so destroying them can be tricky. Pretty straightforward, a capsule is any on-screen object that can be blown open to reveal collectible items. Sometimes a capsule will be delivered by a carrier, or it might be floating through space on its own. It depends on the game, but caravan mode will usually mean that it's a score attack or time attack mode to play in. I'll touch on each of those when we get there though. Chain or chaining, which is also referred to as combo or comboing, can present itself in a variety of ways, but it's essentially anything you do repetitively to gain more of a chain total or combo total. This total will usually have some sort of payoff the higher it gets, but it depends on the game. The most common chaining in shmups revolves around killing enemies consecutively and within a certain amount of time so that you don't lose or break the chain. An example of chaining can be seen in Ikaruga and countless other games. A character shmup is one where you control some type of living, breathing character instead of a spacecraft or some other vehicle. There are countless examples, but Sisters Royale comes to mind, so we'll go with that. A charge shot or charge attack is relatively well known, and it's the same in shmups. These types of attacks will typically require the player to hold down their attack button or a designated button which will charge a more powerful attack before releasing. Pretty standard stuff. For shmups that use them, a checkpoint is a specific area you return to after losing a life or some other condition resulting in a respawn. Checkpoints can function differently in each game, but for the most part being sent to a checkpoint will usually mean your resources, power level, etc. are reset to the default. Based on how the term is used, this one can have several meanings, but I'm only going to focus on a couple. A chip or chips are found in certain STGs and serve as an upgrade item that you can use to augment your ship's stats. You might have 10 free slots and plug in any combination of chips to increase things like ship speed, firepower or fire rate, etc. But if you see it used like chip damage, that's something else entirely. Chip damage is when we are landing an attack on an enemy and the damage is being tallied. I'll touch more on this when we get to tick points since they go hand in hand. Collect 'em up is a basic term for a shmup with a greater focus on collecting items. Combo time is any duration in which you are experiencing a combo. Usually in these temporary phases, your ship or character will receive more points, deal more damage, or whatever else. Occasionally, combo time will be shown by the draining of your gauge or time counting down somewhere on the screen or some other way. Continue service is when you lose all your lives but the game wants to entice you to keep playing. To do this, the game will often leave a bunch of your power-ups or other items so that if you choose to continue, you can get things up to speed without too much suffering. Our favorite part of all, the core, is usually a boss's weak point and obviously the part you want to be shooting. There may be some non-boss enemies that are sizable enough and have their own core. We use counter slop to describe games with chains that won't necessarily break outright if you fail to maintain them. So in other words, the chain total will begin decreasing instead of abruptly dropping to zero. The player can resume the chaining at any time during this decrease. Some games have what is called a counter stop. A counter stop is when the score counter has reached its maximum score and cannot count anything beyond the limit value. Credit feeding is when you use numerous continues to progress through a run. Sometimes you'll be able to continue as many times as you want, other times you will have an absolute maximum of how many times you can continue. Credit muncher just means the game is so hard that the average player will be using a pocket full of credits just to make it through the run. You might have even heard quarter muncher used at one time to imply that the arcade game was tough and stripping you of every last quarter you had. A crowd control weapon is one that will generally be weaker against bosses but great for large groups of smaller, easily destroyed enemies. The attack will often be a widespread covering a large portion of the screen. A cutback is a type of maneuver where the player leads enemy fire in one direction and then makes a sudden jerking motion back. If done fast enough, this causes enemies to retarget the spot the player moved to. The result is often an open space that can be used for safely navigating the bullets. Cute 'em up is what we call a shmup that's going for the whole cute theme, either with its characters, music, art style, or anything else. These types can be just as challenging as anything else despite the appearances. A cutoff mark is evident in some shmups and not so apparent in others, but essentially is a point near the bottom of the screen where enemies will no longer fire from. This is implemented to defend the player against unreasonable deaths due to something like an enemy point blanking the player's ship right before they vanish off the screen. A dead zone is similar to the cutoff mark, except it refers to when the player's ship is close enough to an enemy that they will no longer be fired upon or release suicide bullets. Like the cutoff mark, this is included in some games to prevent unfair death. Furthermore, the size of an enemy's dead zone may be reduced in the second or third loop, increasing the difficulty as a result. Dismantling or deconstructing is always a blast. Some bosses will have individual parts or weaponry the player can destroy without killing the boss. Once those parts have been destroyed, the boss can no longer use them to attack. There are some games where bosses will have replaceable parts, like the Stage 4 boss in Crimson Clover. Doujin can have a few meanings depending on where you look, but generally speaking, it is any self-published form of artwork by a Japanese creator or creators. It could be video games, novels, magazines, anime, etc. Look no further than the Toho project for well-known examples of doujin games. Drill weapons in shmups are not standard, but you'll know it if you see one. They will generally appear as larger melee-style additions to the player's craft. They usually don't pass through an enemy, but instead slow the enemy down considerably while constantly doing damage. Energy can show up in many forms. One of the more predominant uses of an energy system would be for shield barriers, where the player's ship can afford to take direct hits without dying as long as there is energy powering the shield. When a hit is received, the energy level is slightly reduced. If there is no energy remaining and the player takes a hit, loss of life will occur. An energy tank is an on-screen item that grants the player a top-up. In some cases, it may even increase the total amount of energy you have at your disposal. For this one, I'm not going to be super specific because the term Euroshmup has all sorts of different meanings and people will use it to convey different things. Sometimes it's used with regards to an art style or approach, other times it will be used in conjunction with criticism or to express one's dislike for elements or mechanics that Euroshmups are known for. Anyway, here are some common traits for quickly spotting Euroshmups. Health bars, shields, item or upgrade shops, plus in-game currency. Euroshmups will also lack an in-depth scoring system and seldom will you see decent bullet patterns, if any. Enemy AI will also be pretty basic. Bosses will have tons of health, you may even have limited ammunition. There's a lot in this pot and I'm not listing everything. Extend is a word we use to represent gaining an extra life or one-up. It's a term more common in arcade games and even more so in shmups. Extends can often be obtained by reaching a specific score total, picking up an on-screen item, or other ways. One example is the hidden extend during the boss fight in Stage 3 of Mushihime-sama. If the player destroys the boss's legs before destroying the central portion, a secret extend is revealed. Generally speaking, a focus shot is when a player's attack is focused into a concentrated beam from its standard, broader form. Having the option to concentrate our attack on a single enemy is a great way to take out significant threats quickly. Furthermore, the focus shot will almost always slow the player's movement speed, which can be used to our advantage during chaotic moments. Full extent of the jam. You may have heard this classic line and the general amusement associated with it, but never understood what it's all about. In the legal statements of Cave's early games, it was supposed to be full extent of the law, but we ended up with jam due to a legendary misspelling. Gedo tate is when a player lays on their side to play a vertical scrolling shmup in tate mode instead of rotating their television or monitor upright. Sometimes this is done out of laziness or concern for the safety of their screen. You might hear the term Gradius Syndrome or others similar like One Life Game, Power Up Syndrome, etc. Any of these may be used when referring to a game where the player loses all or close to all of their power-ups and additional resources upon losing a life, making a recovery immensely challenging. Grazing can sometimes go by other names, but it's a mechanic found in some shmups where an effect is generated when the player's ship is positioned very close to enemy projectiles. The effects vary from game to game, but increased score or filling a gauge faster are commonly tied to grazing. Some examples of this are Danmaku Unlimited 3, Saivaryar Delta, and even Visara. On occasion, grazing may be referred to as scratching, scraping, or buzzing. A net or grid is a type of attack where multiple lines of bullets cross over each other to create a net-like pattern. Sometimes these attacks will take up the vast majority of the screen or a small portion. There will typically be one or more safe spots between the overlapping bullet lines where players can remain untouched, but space for free movement will be almost non-existent. One such example would be any of the final bosses from the Visara games. A hitbox is the designated point or area which the game uses to detect whether or not a collision of one sort or another has occurred. The player's ship, enemies, bosses, projectiles, objects in the environment, and even the terrain itself can all have a hitbox. Hitboxes are not always visible. Some shmups will give you no indication, leaving it up to the player to learn what spot to protect. For games that do display the hitbox, it can appear in different ways. The commonly used indication is a flashing dot in the middle of the player's ship, the glowing core of a boss, or some other noticeable marking. Like you'd assume, a homing weapon is anything used by the player or the enemy that has homing capabilities. Sometimes a homing attack will lock on and never miss. Other times it will only target for a short duration before heading straight off the screen, making them the most straightforward type to avoid. A horizontal scroller is a game where the stages scroll horizontally. Some games will be free roaming in this sense, allowing the player to move either left or right and thus control the scrolling. But more often than not, horizontal shmups will scroll so that the right side is coming into view while the left side is vanishing. I seldom see this anywhere, but hybrid attacks are two individual attacks combined to create a more powerful attack. These types of attacks are usually only found in two-player shmups. A hyper system can pretty much go by any name since games can call it whatever they want. But a hyper system is usually any mechanic where accumulated gauge resources or energy can be spent to enter a stronger state, attain invincibility for a short period, or achieve some other benefit. Sometimes a combination of things can happen upon activating such a state, like clearing all enemy projectiles on screen. Examples of this are Dodonpachi Daifukatsu with its use of a hyper counter system, Crimson Clover's break and double break mode, or Danmaku Unlimited 3's trance mode. This powered up state will usually only last until the energy in the gauge has emptied. You may hear invincibility window or sometimes flash window. These terms describe a duration in which your craft or character is flashing and cannot be harmed. The most common situations you'll experience are during the first few seconds of a level, when you return to the screen after losing a life, or when you use a bomb. Having a moment or two of iframes can be highly advantageous if we use them intelligently. A recent example I can share comes from the final boss of Dodonpachi Daifukatsu. You can do a greater amount of damage when point blanking with your laser, so I'll often do this immediately after activating my hyper or when using a bomb. The payoff is terrific since I can sometimes refill my entire hyper gauge before the bomb finishes detonating. Rinse and repeat. Invisible bullet syndrome is what we call any given instance where enemy projectiles are hard to spot. It could be due to the bullet colors blending in with the landscape or background, or it could be due to a high volume of on-screen debris or other bullets, or something else entirely. Sometimes STGs will have kamikaze or suicide units that don't fire at the player but fly towards the player's craft to collide instead. Your kill rate is the percentage of enemies you destroyed in any given stage. Bonus points are often received at the end of the stage, and the higher your kill rate, the more bonus you earn. When a shmup has a variation or re-release of the original game, you'll often see the word label attached to it, especially when it comes to games by Cave. The labels you'll see are usually white, black, death, blue, and red. There isn't really an official definition for each type, but the generally accepted meanings have white representing the original release of the game, black being an improved version or a re-release with fairly major changes. Death label is a stageless version only offering a boss rush experience, and blue or red label are typically arranged versions made for special events. I often use the word layer when referring to the background or foreground scenery of a 2D side-scroller like Mutant Mudds. It can be used in the same way for shmups, but it also has another meaning. A layer represents a specific attack that a boss or enemy makes when multiple attack patterns cross over each other. Dodging multiple layers can be extremely difficult. The player must pay attention to each layer and know how best to maneuver through the oncoming bullet wave. Timing is an essential part of this, as varied attacks can move at different speeds. Similar to homing weapons, but lock-on weapons require you to first lock on fully or at least partially before you can attack. Sometimes using a complete lock-on will mean higher damage output as opposed to a partial lock-on. A loop is what we call a single run through all of the game's stages. The term is usually reserved for games with multiple loops, otherwise we'd just call it a run. Sometimes a loop will be called a round, but I never see anyone using that alternative. Completing the first loop of a game will have the player begin at the start once again, except the difficulty will be much greater. There may be times where certain conditions must be met to access the second loop, alternate routes, or even a true last boss waiting at the end of the second loop. A great example of this is once again Dodonpachi Daifukatsu, where some things involved are bee collecting, destroying specific objects, and securing a 1cc. Typically your score will remain after the first loop is complete so that you can continue scoring in the second loop and beyond, but this may not always be the case depending on the game. It's important to note that not all players will consider the initial set of stages to be Loop 1, and instead will consider the second cycle to be Loop 1. Technicalities and preferences aside, I'm sure you get the idea. If unfamiliar, you may want to take note of how stage numbers are written when a game has multiple loops. Here's a short list showing what it looks like. A manic shooter, bullet sprayer, or dodge 'em up is a type of shmup where there are tons of enemies and bullets on screen at any given time. These types of games are geared more towards fast reflexes and continuously dodging as opposed to memory shmups. A memory shmup is any shmup where repetition and memorization are essential to effectively managing each stage. These are especially demanding because survival, let alone playing well, will require that you know precisely where enemies spawn, what they do, the entire layout of the level, etc. In games like this, you'll pretty much want to be exactly where you need to be 95% of the time because they can be that ruthless. A perfect example of this is Devil Engine. A more famous example though would be R-Type. Milking or leeching can be experienced in a variety of ways. The main idea is to take advantage of a specific time, object, or enemy where we know copious amounts of points or resources can be obtained. One example would be intentionally prolonging a boss fight with additional enemies spawning. Unless there is a time limit, we can virtually remain in the battle forever and destroy enemies continuously to increase our score. Milking can be risky though, because some games increase the fight's difficulty the longer it lasts. Mines are not so common, but you'll still see them from time to time if enemies are dropping them or if they are available to the player. A mine will usually be an object that is either stationary or one that slowly moves down or across the screen. Some mines won't do anything unless you collide with them, while others will detect if the player is close enough and detonate, sending deadly chunks out in a burst. Multipliers are scoring devices found in many modern shmups, and they are often the backbone of scoring systems. Sometimes a multiplier will be based around killing enemies, resulting in your score being multiplied. Other times it may revolve around picking up collectible items that increase or prolong the score multiplier. The variations are endless, so you can see all sorts of ways multipliers are used depending on your game. Naked describes when a shmup player is sitting in their chair naked and just enjoying their game. No, I'm just kidding. Naked describes a player's ship when it is in the default state with no power-ups, additional gear, etc. Usually your ship will be naked when you start the run or when you die if you're playing a game where everything is lost upon death. A needle is a special type of laser weapon that is usually fired in rapid succession or burst. Needles differ from larger, slower laser beams and sometimes have homing capabilities to one extent or another. When you see the term miss, that just means a player death, and a no miss means the opposite, that you didn't lose a single life. These two terms are used in STGs often and especially in all sorts of games from Japan. Depending on what you're talking about or aiming to achieve, it can apply to a stage, multiple stages, a single fight, or the entire run. For example, Billy Bob Wendelton can no-miss the first two stages of Radiant Silver Gun, but no matter how much he practices, he still hasn't been able to no-miss stage 3. Keep at it, Billy, you'll get there one day. In plenty of games, there will be a large score bonus for each stage you no-miss. Sometimes other benefits or unlockables will be accessible if you no-miss a certain number of stages or the entire run. We call a shmup a one-hit wonder when the player's ship cannot survive a single hit. Even if you're sitting at the maximum power level and have all the extra gear, you can be taken out just as easily. This one may trip some people up the first time they see it because your initial thought might be in-game options that you can adjust, like audio, controls, filters, etc. But an option or multiple is actually something we can obtain which adds additional weaponry to our arsenal or some other helpful ability. You may even start the game with an option depending on what you're playing, but for the most part options will be things you grab after the start of the run. Options will generally resemble small robotic pods, a tiny ship that flies in a fixed position close to your ship's top or bottom, or it could be at the front, back, or even orbiting your ship. In some games you may even be able to control the option's position and where it shoots. Sometimes it will even cancel out enemy fire that collides with it. There are all sorts of variations to how options function. Painting is what we call attacking with a spread shot weapon while moving back and forth to create an all-encompassing spray-like attack. The continuous movement in conjunction with the attack makes it look like the player is painting an entire area with bullets, flames, etc. Panic bombing is what we do when we realize there is likely no way to avoid being hit. Sometimes it will be a conscious act, while other times it will be a reflex due to a surprise attack or something closing in faster than anticipated. Reflexes that save you are great. Reflexes that have you triggering a hyper and bomb right after, thus cancelling the hyper and rendering it wasted, are not so great. I've done this a few times in DDP due to frantic moments. Pan-scrolling is used in some shmups, and it just means that the total playable area is more than what you will see in a single location. In other words, if you start a stage in the middle of the screen and move to the right edge, the screen will continue to move, revealing the additional play area until you reach the absolute edge of the field. The same is true for the left side in these situations. A pea shooter is a very weak or underwhelming weapon with little to no capacity to power up. The default power level in some Game Boy shmups is a prime example. A phase usually refers to a boss fight in which the boss will go from one phase to the next once a certain amount of damage has been dealt by the player or if enough time has passed. A boss may become more dangerous during a different phase. They might use different or stronger attacks or even transform in some way. Piercing is a weapon quality found in some STGs where the projectiles can pass through enemies and continue traveling, hitting any other enemies behind them. Just think of Keiji Maeda from Vasara. His craft comes with large javelins that pierce everything in their path. Point blank or point blanking is what we call those situations where you position your ship super close to an enemy or boss while shooting. There are a number of reasons players may do this, but the main ones are as follows. Let's say you have a very wide spread shot. The further away from a target, the less damage that target takes because our attack is too broad. When we point blank, the entirety of our attack is focused on that one enemy because the sides of the attack can't help but hit our foe. Point blanking is sometimes also used to score a greater bonus. For example, medium to large sized ships in Ghostblade HD will drop more gold tokens when we destroy them by point blanking instead of from a greater distance. Another example is point blanking with our laser in Dodonpachi Daifukatsu, which fills our hyper gauge faster and does more damage. In games where it's relevant, point blanking is much more dangerous but very, very rewarding. Since I just talked about point blanking, I'm sure you can gather what point blank range is, but just in case, point blank range is the precise point in which the player's craft is within range to do point blank damage, or trigger anything that requires successful point blanking. Everyone loves popcorn and shmups. It's a fact of life that can have no argument. I don't want to hear it. This term also goes by Zakko or cannon fodder. Popcorn or popcorn enemies are the weakest of the weak. Zakko actually means coarse fish or small fry in Japanese. Anyway, these enemies are destroyed when receiving a single hit or two from your weapon. They are typically the most numerous, often swarming the screen in large groups, and it's always so satisfying popping them out of existence. We're not dropping anchor in the starport, but if you're unsure what a port is, it's just what we call a game that gets converted to a different platform from its original platform. A great example is any original arcade release that gets re-released on home consoles. Everyone knows what power-ups are, and they work the same in STGs. You can get power-ups in many ways, but one of the most common is grabbing an on-screen item. Most games will have a hard limit for how many power levels you can gain. On the other hand, power downs are both very common and not so common, depending on the type. For instance, when you take a hit and lose a life, you'll be powered down to one degree or another more often than not. But some shmups contain on-screen items that you will likely want to avoid because they remove one level of your total accumulated power. Waifu Discovered 2 is an excellent example of this with its red items you'll want to avoid at all costs. Power levels can also play an important role in games using a rank system. Like many things in shmups, rank can be expressed in countless ways. However, the plain and simple of it is when a game's system modifies the difficulty level based on either option settings or a player's performance. Achieving a higher rank can sometimes mean enemies take longer to destroy, they attack more often, or more enemies spawn. There are all sorts of combinations that can be experienced. An example I'll share is once again Dodonpachi Daifukatsu because I've been playing a ton of that lately and love it. But among other things, the higher your rank, the less effective your hyper is at eliminating enemy projectiles. Some players will intentionally power down to increase the chance of survival if they get too high a rank and want to balance out the difficulty. Replays are sometimes an included feature where the player's run is automatically recorded while playing. After the run is over, the player will have the option to save a copy of the replay, which can be accessed in the replay menu. This is an invaluable feature as it means you don't always need to be recording every session you play. If you are casually chipping away and have a decent run where you clear the game, you've got it recorded already. Respawn can occasionally refer to enemies respawning, but most of the time it relates to an instantaneous respawning of your ship or character in the exact position it died. A lot of older games were very punishing because they didn't work this way. Instead, if you lost a life, you'd often start at the beginning of the stage or a checkpoint. Respawn encourages people to keep playing because you're instantly back in the action and don't need to work your way through an area you've already played 1,000 times. I cannot express this enough, but restarts are a godsend, and games that don't have them are so much more tedious to deal with when you want to practice. But anyway, a restart is simply an option in the pause menu where you can restart the stage if you have fumbled something and want a fresh start. The alternative would be to go all the way back to the title screen or training menu and reselect your setup and desired stage, which is all very time consuming. A great example of restarts done right is Crimson Clover, and that game takes it a step further. Instead of only giving the option to restart the stage, players have the choice to restart stage 1 if they are beyond that level already, or restart the stage they are currently in. It's honestly the best. I don't often see this, but in some STGs the game will not strip you of valuable power-ups, items, or other enhancements when you lose a life. To ride just means you are positioning your craft over top of an enemy or part of a large boss. In some situations you would take damage or lose a life when coming into contact with an enemy unit, but players will do this intentionally when they have an invincibility window and benefit from point-blanking the enemy. The on-hand example I have is once again the final boss fight in Dodonpachi Daifukatsu. When the player bombs or uses a hyper, you have a few moments of invincibility. You can quickly fill your gauge using your laser while also using bombs to linger there and do more significant damage. RNG is a short form for random number generation or random number generator. The term is used to describe anything that is influenced or decided by randomness. It's not the most common in shmups, but you'll still see some games that apply RNG to one degree or another. An example of RNG could be a boss selecting its own attacks based on several available options instead of strict programming, forcing the boss to always follow attack A with attack B, C, etc. Another example could be enemy projectiles firing in a random direction or enemy spawn locations being randomized instead of fixed. Of course, there's much more to it than this, but I don't feel it's necessary to go overboard. A safe spot or safe zone is a specific location on the screen where the player can position themselves and avoid being hit. These spots sometimes exist due to something being overlooked during the game's design process. Other times they may be discovered by triggering a glitch or by simply exploiting another aspect of the game's system entirely. One game that comes to mind is Solar Striker. A few of the bosses can be completely dealt with by firing from a single location. This takes away from the challenge, but exploits such as this are extremely useful if you struggle with other parts of the run and want to make up for those parts. Score Attack is an additional mode usually consisting of a single level and no limit to how many lives the player has. On average, Score Attack levels are around the 3-minute mark, and the objective is to earn as high of a score as your skills allow. In most shmups, a score reset happens when a player loses all of their lives and uses a credit to continue playing. This prevents people from making false claims about their score and how many credits were used. Shields can be implemented in various ways. It might be a default ability or something you obtain as an enhancement during the run. You might have a single hit shield that will cancel out after receiving a hit but leaves your craft untouched. You might also have a shield system with an energy bar, and some amount will drain from the gauge when receiving damage. There are all sorts to experience. One of my favorites is ensnared in binary stars. You can obtain a passive shield that can absorb one hit. After that, it will recharge as long as you are not firing. It's a great way of mixing risk-reward into the gameplay, since you can essentially remain untouched as long as you're skilled and very careful with it. SHMUP is simply a short form for shoot 'em up and is an alternative to STG. There are many technicalities and exceptions with this one. In general, a SHMUP is a game using a third-person perspective where you control a small craft or character and shoot tons of enemies or objects while scrolling through a two-dimensional series of levels. If you're completely unfamiliar with shmups, it's easy to confuse them with run-and-gun games or anything else with lots of shooting. Some people might let that slide or even still consider them shmups, but others won't. Like I said, there are all sorts of technicalities, but you're probably safe if you just think small craft, scrolling along, blowing things up, and dodging. Shrapnel is another self-explanatory term. It can be observed in some STGs and, in most cases, will be debris that flies away from a destroyed enemy or boss. Sometimes shrapnel will cause damage or result in a loss of life, while other times it is only there for show. Not hard to guess, but a single screen shmup is one where the entirety of the game is played in a single screen area. The player's perspective will usually be top-down or head-on. So there are a couple of types of slowdown you can experience in shmups. The first is the programming type, which can occur when the screen is filled with tons of projectiles at a single time and the frame rate drops as a result. Mushihime-sama is an excellent example of this. Slowdown can be taken advantage of during very thick or complex bullet patterns, since the slowdown allows for more precise maneuvering and time to plan ahead. The other type of slowdown is when you're using a focus shot, and your ship's speed is reduced as a result. This can also be used to navigate challenging parts of a stage safely. Snakes are a type of enemy found in STGs and many other games. They possess long bodies made up of individual parts. Sometimes a snake can be destroyed piece by piece, other times the enemy will have a specific weak point and destroying that segment will eliminate the enemy. Great examples of snakes or snake-like enemies can be seen in Danmaku Unlimited 3, Mushihime-sama, Crimson Clover, and many other shmups. A sneak kill is any number of situations where the player suffers a seemingly unfair loss of life. People can often feel as though there was no way to outmaneuver the threat or that it was a cheap shot of sorts. Snipers can appear at random and very abruptly and attack with little to no time for responding. Occasionally they will emerge behind the player, which can be deadly if unexpected. Special weapons in STGs are essentially additional weaponry you either start with or can obtain during the run. These types are usually more powerful than your primary weapon, but will have a limitation of some sort, like low ammo count, charge time required, etc. In some games, bombs are completely replaced by special weapons, or they closely resemble a bomb's function. For instance, Devil Engine doesn't have screen-clearing bombs as we know them, but each of the three weapon types has its own unique attack. These attacks are extremely powerful, and using them is essential to taking down bosses quickly before things get too crazy. I don't play too many STGs that include speed adjustment, but they are a default feature allowing the player to adjust between a few different movement speeds. This will most commonly offer slow, medium, and fast, and allow people to play with the speed they find the most comfortable or switch the speed when necessary. Devil Engine has speed adjustment, and I found it very useful for specific sections. Speed zones are sections of a stage where things seem to be moving more rapidly than normal. On occasion, this will be nothing more than a visual effect, but there may be times when you're flying through a tight area with walls and the enemies are actually coming at you much faster. Splash damage is any damage an enemy receives from a source already triggered. In games that feature this form of damage, it will typically be displayed through the use of bombs. For instance, the player might drop a bomb and the explosion lingers in a specific area on the screen. Enemies coming into contact with this area will receive damage even though the bomb may have been dropped seconds before. A spread is any attack from the player, an enemy, or boss which fires numerous bullets that spread out as they travel. If you ever wondered, STG just means shooting game, which is the most common term for these types of games in Japan. Like snipers, a striker is an enemy that generally appears quickly, fires a quick shot, and then leaves the screen immediately. Strikers can be deadly, and destroying them fast enough can be very challenging. Suicide is the act of intentionally losing a life. This one may sound counterproductive at first, but there are situations where making this sacrifice nets you a greater advantage. For example, it may grant you additional invincibility to get a head start on damaging a challenging boss. or it may help reduce rank so that an upcoming section is less difficult to deal with. Suicide bullets are sometimes called revenge bullets or return bullets, but it all means the same thing. They're usually fired directly at the player or their general direction by enemies who have just been destroyed. Suicide bullets normally don't enter the picture until the second loop begins and the difficulty increases. A super play is a video replay of a very skilled player's run through any given game they've mastered or at least conquered. There will usually be text documenting how the player approached difficult sections, or sometimes the player will even be on screen sharing that information while watching along. Super plays are very helpful as they grant a wide range of valuable techniques, tricks, etc. You can learn an absolute mountain of info that can help if you're struggling with the same game. Tate is Japanese for vertical, and it refers to a mode of viewing featured in some vertical scrolling shmups. If available and you want to play in Tate, you would rotate the game's playfield 90 degrees in the options. You would then turn your television or monitor 90 degrees so that the vertical scrolling shmup is upright and filling the entire screen. No more side panels to deal with. You may hear some people pronounce Tate as Tate. This comes from the misconception that Tate comes from the word rotate, but it was never Tate. A tickle refers to a weapon that requires very close range to damage an enemy or boss. These types will often have a high damage output to balance the added risk of getting super close to an enemy. My absolute favorite example of this is Omega Fighter. One of the two available weapons is an energetic buzzsaw that gets shorter and shorter the more power-ups you obtain for it. But the shorter it gets, the more damage it does. The risk-reward is perfectly crafted in this game. Tick points are what we call the continuous increase of points when our bullets are hitting any given enemy, regardless of whether or not we destroy them. Not every game will grant this type of bonus, and it usually won't amount to an insane increase, but it's at least a little extra something for landing our shots on enemies. Time attack is similar to score attack, except instead of the player's session ending when the stage does, they have a time limit. During this time, the player is to score as high as possible. A timeout is when you're frustrated and mom says you need to step away from the controller for a while. Jokes aside, this term is used to describe the event where we have not done enough damage to destroy a boss and they fly away to terrorize some distant planet due to our negligence. This is sometimes implemented to stop players from exploiting scoring opportunities. Other times a boss might be undefeatable and the fight is simply testing how well you maneuver until the battle times out. TLB is short for True Last Boss, and it's one of my favorite terms because True Last Bosses are almost always the most over-the-top fights and the best kind of rush. TLBs are often only accessible when certain conditions are met, such as one ceasing the run, completing 2 loops, dying no more than a single time, or any other combination you can imagine. I don't recall any recent STGs that I've seen an uphill perspective in, but regardless, some shmups have stages that look as though they tilt toward the player to one degree or another. This makes it look as though things are moving up a slope. A vertical scroller or vertical shmup is what we call games in the genre that scroll from top to bottom. The perspective is usually top-down, though there are exceptions. This differs from the perspective used in horizontal shmups, where players look at the side of their ship or character. In STGs, a wall is a wall. You'll mostly see walls in vertical scrolling games and ceilings or floors in horizontal scrolling games. Walls will almost always be designed to cause damage or life loss if the player collides with its surface. A wave can mean a few things. It could represent a wave-like attack pattern that spreads out in a wave. It might refer to a group of enemies that scrolls into view during part of a stage, or even a large sheet of curved energy. Wraparound scrolling is when a stage's playing field has no edge. The player's ship may continue moving left or right until it reaches the position it started from. I've played very few STGs with this, but a fantastic example is in GGLesta 3 during the rocket launch stage. Well everyone, that brings our time with shmup terminology to an end. I certainly didn't cover every detail for each term, but I'm trusting this has proven helpful to you anyway. Let me know in the comments what terms you had never heard before, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to fling a like my way and consider subscribing for more STG goodness. Have a stellar one everybody, and we'll see you next time.